It was a warm, late September afternoon by the edge of Lake Berryessa in Napa County, California. Golden sunlight danced on the gentle ripples of the water as Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard lounged on their picnic blanket, laughing softly. A light breeze carried the scent of pine and dry grass. Everything felt still, almost idyllic, until Cecilia's laughter tapered off. She had a sudden, inexplicable feeling that someone was watching them. Brian followed her gaze across the tree line. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just oak trees and brush along the lake shore. Then, about 30 yards away, a figure emerged from behind a broad trunk. A man was standing there, half in shadow. Brian squinted, thinking maybe the stranger was a hiker or fisherman, but the man didn't carry any fishing rod or gear. Instead, he slowly raised his hand, and Brian's stomach clenched as he realized the man was pulling something dark over his own face. In an instant, the peaceful afternoon turned sinister. The man stepped forward into a patch of sunlight, and Brian's breath caught in his throat. The stranger was wearing some kind of hood, a black executioner's hood, draped over his head and shoulders. Large, clip-on sunglasses were attached over the eye holes, disguising his face completely. Pinned on his chest was a bizarre symbol, a white circle with a cross through it, like a gun sight. In his hand, unmistakably, was a Gunin, wikipedia.org. Cecilia's hand gripped Brian's arm. "Oh my God," she whispered, voice quivering. Neither of them had ever seen anything like this. The hooded man approached with an eerie, deliberate calm. Brian's mind raced. Was this some kind of prank? A late Halloween trick? But the gun in the man's gloved hand was no prank. Brian instinctively raised his hands, trying to appear non-threatening. His heart thudded against his ribs as the figure closed the distance. "Take it easy," Brian said, attempting a steady tone. "We don't want any trouble." Beside him, Cecilia was already trembling. The man's voice came out muffled from beneath the hood, oddly calm, almost monotone. "I'm going to need your money and your car keys," he said. "It's a robbery," Brian thought with a flicker of relief. If it was just a desperate thief, maybe they could survive this. He hurriedly nodded. "Sure, anything you want," Brian replied. He reached into his pocket and fished out his keys, holding them out on an open palm. Cecilia grabbed their picnic basket and turned it over, shaking out a few crumpled dollars. Her hands shook so badly that one bill fluttered away on the breeze. The hooded man stepped closer and took the car keys from Brian's hand. The gun never wavered. Its barrel, large and dark, was aimed steadily at the young couple. Brian noticed the man's hands were covered in black cloth gloves, despite the day's lingering heat. Cold dread coiled in Brian's gut. The man's attire and composure didn't match that of a panicked fugitive or common thief. Cecilia must have sensed it too. We have a little money," she stammered. "You can take the car, please. Just don't hurt us." For a moment, the only sounds were a distant chirp of crickets and the lapping of water against the shore. Then the man spoke again, voice flat and effectless. "I just escaped from a prison," he said. "In Montana. Killed a guard. I need to get to Mexico." Brian felt Cecilia's grip tighten on his arm. The man's words hung in the air, absurd and terrifying. Brian's mouth went dry. He didn't know whether to believe the story. It sounded like a lie. But why would he lie? More importantly, he realized with dawning horror, if this man had killed before, he wouldn't hesitate to kill again. Brian tried to keep his voice calm. "Look, take our car," he offered gently. "Take anything. We won't say a word. You can tie us up, whatever you need to do." His own words sent a spike of fear through him. Why had he mentioned tying up? The thought of being left bound and helpless out here made his pulse race. But if it was the price of surviving, he would pay it. The man seemed to consider. He nodded once. "Turn around. Both of you. Now." Slowly, Brian and Cecilia obeyed, exchanging one last terrified glance as they did. Brian clenched Cecilia's hand briefly, as if to say it'll be okay. He hoped he was right. Behind them, footsteps crunched in the dry grass. Brian stared at the ground, heart thumping so loudly he thought it would burst. He felt the man come up close. The gun was still aimed at them. He could sense it at his back, like a burning brand. "Cecilia, take this." The man tossed something toward them. Lengths of plastic clothesline, already cut into pieces. "Tie his wrists," the muffled voice ordered in Wikipedia.org. Cecilia let out a soft sob, but picked up the rope. With trembling fingers, she began winding it around Brian's wrists in front of him. Brian caught a glimpse of her face. Tears welled in her eyes, and her breath came shallow and fast. He tried to give her a reassuring look, but he was as scared as she was. She tied a knot, but the man stepped forward and checked it with a swift yank. It slipped loose. "Tighter," he snapped, shoving another piece of rope at her. Cecilia choked back a cry and retied the knot, pulling until Brian winced at the cord biting into his skin. "That's enough," the man said. He forced Brian down to his knees, then onto his stomach. Brian's face pressed into the blanket and dirt. He felt the muzzle of the gun at the back of his neck and squeezed his eyes shut, expecting a bullet. But instead, he heard the rustle of the man handing rope to Cecilia again. "Now tie up his legs, and be quick." Cecilia moved to Brian's ankles, her hands shaking so badly she fumbled the rope. It took her 2 tries to secure his feet. The entire time, Brian's mind screamed with panic. Is this really just a robbery? If so, why hadn't the man simply taken the keys and run? Why tie them up here? Once Brian was bound hand and foot, the man ordered Cecilia to lie down as well, on your stomach next to him. "Put your hands behind you," he said flatly. Cecilia's eyes met Brian's for a fleeting second. They were wide with terror. She lowered herself down on the blanket beside him. Brian could feel her body trembling against his. The man knelt and began binding Cecilia's wrists together behind her back, using his own rope now. He pulled the cords brutally tight. Cecilia gasped in pain. Brian's face was half turned in the dirt, but he saw the hooded figure concentrate on the knots, breathing heavily through the mask. When Cecilia's wrists and ankles were lashed together, the man double-checked all the knots, yanking hard. Brian felt a flare of anger at the needless cruelty, but it was smothered by dread. Brian mustered the courage to speak. "Sir, you have what you want. Please, you can go now. Just leave us here and go," he said. Voice strained but polite, as if reasoning with a wild animal. For a moment, the man didn't respond. He stood over them, looming, the gun still in his fist. Brian could only see the man's legs from his position, heavy set, clad in dark pleated pants and brown shoes coated in dust. No one moved. A dragonfly buzzed in the silence, zipping past Brian's ear. Then Brian heard a chilling metallic sound. The man was sheathing his gun, sliding it away into a holster or waistband. In the same motion, he drew out something else, a blade. The sunlight caught it for an instant, a long, glinting knife. Brian's blood turned to ice. "We gave you everything?" Cecilia whimpered desperately. She was sobbing now. "Please," the man stepped toward them. Brian felt a shadow fall over his back. Don't, Brian shouted, twisting around as best he could. But the ropes held him fast. Without a word, the man plunged the knife down. Cecilia screamed, a raw, piercing sound that ripped across the quiet lake shore. The blade came down again and again in a frenzied motion. Brian felt searing pain explode through his back as the knife found him too. He yelled in agony, the sound mingling with Cecilia's screams. The man stabbed with vicious force, each thrust accompanied by a grunt of effort. Brian's vision blurred with tears and shock as fiery pain lanced through his body. Once, twice, 6 times. He heard Cecilia choking on screams beside him. She had fallen silent after the first few strikes. He could only hear her ragged breathing now. Brian's mind was spinning. This can't be happening. This can't be real. A voice in his head repeated. As abruptly as it began, the stabbing stopped. Brian felt the weight of the man's gaze on them. He was standing over the bloodied, bound couple, watching them struggle and writhe. Brian's ears rang, and his body was on fire. He tried to move, but could barely inch forward. His limbs wouldn't cooperate. He tasted copper in his mouth and realized he was coughing blood. Footsteps rustled on grass. Through a haze of pain, Brian saw the hooded figure walk unhurriedly back toward the road where their car was parked. The man was leaving them for dead. Cecilia gave a soft, wet moan. Brian blinked sweat and tears out of his eyes and forced himself to focus. We're alive, he thought. We're still alive. The man hadn't shot them execution style. Perhaps he assumed the knife had done enough. But Brian wasn't ready to die here. Not like this. And certainly not to let Cecilia die if he could help it. He rolled onto his side, biting back a scream as pain jolted through his midsection. His chest and back were soaked with blood. Cecilia, he rasped. She didn't respond. Her eyes were closed. Blood smeared her back and the blanket beneath her. Brian wriggled closer, ignoring the burning in his 6 stab wounds, and began frantically working at the ropes on his wrists. The killer had left, but they had to get help now. Brian's fingers were slick with blood, and the knots were tight. He contorted, bringing his bound hands under his legs to get them in front of him, despite the rope biting his flesh. His hands were free enough now to reach Cecilia's bindings with trembling fingers, and using his teeth where his hands failed, Brian fought to loosen the ropes around Cecilia's wrists and Wikipedia.org. It felt like an eternity. But at last, the cord gave way. Cecilia let out a faint cry as circulation returned painfully to her arms. We have to get help, Brian panted. Each breath was torture. He wasn't even sure how deep his wounds were. Adrenaline was numbing some of the pain. Cecilia nodded weakly, eyes glassy. With great effort, they struggled up from the ground. Brian managed to get to one knee, then collapsed. The world tilted, and black spots swarmed his vision. He could hear Cecilia sobbing, whispering his name, but it sounded distant. Somewhere far off, a child's voice shouted something indistinct. Brian forced his eyes open. Across the shimmering surface of the lake, he saw a boat, a small fishing boat with a father and son out for the afternoon. Brian's heart leapt. He gathered every ounce of strength left in his body and screamed toward the water, "Help! Please help us!" His shout came out more as a gurgling croak. He coughed and tried again. Cecilia, swaying on her knees, raised a hand toward the boat. By a stroke of mercy, the fisherman's son had heard something. The boat was turning toward shore. Brian collapsed fully now, dizzy and cold. As consciousness began to slip, he felt Cecilia's hand find his. He clutched it weakly. Sirens were wailing in the distance. Or was that just the ringing in his ears? The sky above swirled, the blue dotted with indifferent clouds. Brian fixed his gaze on Cecilia's pale face and willed himself to hold on. Help is coming. Just hold on. Detective Ken Narlow arrived at the hospital just after nightfall, heart pounding with a mix of urgency and dread. The scene at Lake Berryessa had already been cleared by the time he got word. Two young people, viciously attacked in broad daylight. The assailant vanished. It didn't sound like any ordinary crime, and Ken Narlow had been in law enforcement long enough to sense when something was different. He found the emergency ward room where a 20-year-old man lay pale and bandaged, barely clinging to consciousness. Brian Hartnell had survived the nightmare by the lake, though just barely. 6 stab wounds riddled his back, and he was weak from blood loss. By some miracle, he was stable after surgery. At the bedside, a doctor was quietly updating a nurse, and a Napa County deputy stood by taking notes. Detective Narlow paused in the doorway, steeling himself. He had interviewed plenty of victims before, but the brutality of this attack in Napa Valley, such violence was almost unheard of. How's he doing? Narlow asked the deputy in a hushed voice. The deputy, Dave Collins, shook his head. He's awake, on and off, drifting. The girl, Collins hesitated, eyes downcast. Shepard, Cecilia Shepard. She didn't make it. Died a couple hours ago, in the ICU. Narlow closed his eyes briefly. He'd heard Cecilia was unresponsive upon arrival. 10 stab wounds. Too many. Still, the confirmation hit hard. 2 bright young lives shattered. One extinguished, one hanging by a thread. And for what? The assailant hadn't even stolen anything substantial. According to initial reports, it seemed he only wanted to hurt them. The detective stepped to Brian's bedside. Brian's eyes were half open, unfocused, until Narlow gently announced himself. Brian, I'm Detective Narlow with Napa County, he said softly. I'm so sorry this happened. I know you're in pain, but I need to ask you a few questions. Try to find the man who did this. Brian blinked, gathering his thoughts. Despite heavy pain medication, anguish flickered in his eyes. Cecilia, is she? His voice was a ragged whisper, but the question was clear. Narlow felt a lump in his throat. She's in heaven now, he replied quietly. Brian squeezed his eyes shut as a tear slid down to his pillow. The detective waited a respectful moment, then continued. Brian, anything you can remember about the attacker will help. Did you see his face at all? Brian shook his head weakly. He had a hood, a black hood over his head, like an executioner, he murmured. There were sunglasses on it, like to cover his eyes. Deputy Collins nodded. The description matched what Cecilia had managed to tell them briefly before she lost consciousness. About 6 feet tall, heavy set? Collins prompted. Brian confirmed with a faint nod. His voice, was there an accent or anything distinctive? Narlow asked. Brian swallowed. Not really. It was muffled, calm, cold. He winced as he shifted slightly. He said he escaped from prison, but I don't know if that was true. He lied about just robbing us. Brian added bitterly, a tremor in his voice. Narlow's jaw tightened. He claimed to be a prison escapee? That detail was new. Brian recounted as best he could. The man said he needed money and a car to go to Mexico, that he had killed a guard to get out in wikipedia.org.wikipedia.org. Narlow scribbled in his notebook. No known inmate escapes in recent memory matched that story, likely a fabrication to lower the victim's guard. It spoke to an unusual kind of criminal, one who planned a deceit. He had that symbol on his chest, Brian continued haltingly, a circle and cross. I don't know what it means, but Brian's eyes suddenly widened with a thought. He, he said something when he left. Or maybe I imagined it. I was losing blood. He trailed off, brow furrowed, as if straining to recall. Narlo leaned in. Anything, even if it sounds strange. Brian licked his dry lips. I could swear I heard him say, almost to himself, I'm going to call it in, like he was going to report it. Brian gave a weak, humorless chuckle that turned into a cough. Why would he do that? He attacked us, then said he was going to call the cops on himself? Deputy Collins and Detective Narlo exchanged looks. It was strange, unless this attacker had done that before. Narlo's mind raced back to another crime, just 2 months earlier, in July, in Vallejo. A shooter ambushed a young couple at a lover's lane there, killing the woman and gravely wounding the man. Narlo had heard about it because the Vallejo Police Department had received an anonymous phone call reporting that crime, apparently from the killer himself in .wikipedia.org. Collins spoke up, voice grim. Detective, you thinking what I'm thinking? Vallejo. Narlo nodded slowly. The Vallejo attacks, and last year, on Lake Herman Road. He flipped back a few pages in his notebook, where he had jotted some comparisons earlier. Multiple attacks on young couples in secluded areas, seemingly random and motiveless. But for the kill, Vallejo PD had been grappling with that nightmare for months now, and the phone call details cinched it. This had to be the same perpetrator. Brian was drifting again, eyelids heavy. Narlo gently patted his shoulder. Thank you, Brian. You've been incredibly brave. We'll let you rest now. We'll do everything we can to catch this man. I promise. Brian gave a faint nod as tears leaked from the corners of his eyes, whether from pain or grief or both. Outside the room, Narlo pulled Deputy Collins aside. I need to call Vallejo PD right away. If this is connected, we've got a serial on our hands. Collins sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I think we already do. Vallejo got letters a while back, weird letters taking credit for their shootings. The guy called himself, he snapped his fingers as the memory came, Zodiac, like the astrological signs. You hear about that? Narlo had. Every cop in Northern California had heard the rumors. A psycho sending cryptograms and letters to the newspapers, claiming responsibility for murder sin. Wikipedia, Oregon. Wikipedia. Org. It sounded like something out of a pulp novel. A killer with a code name taunting the press and police. Some believed it was a hoax or a crank trying to latch onto the publicity of the Vallejo shootings. But now, standing in the stark hospital hallway, Detective Narlo felt a chill that told him it was all too real. This hooded figure at Lake Berryessa was the man behind those letters. He had to be. We have to warn everyone, Narlo said, already moving toward a phone. If the Zodiac is out here, nobody's safe. His words hung in the cold corridor air. Collins nodded and hurried off to inform the sheriff and others. Narlo paused, hand on the phone receiver, and took a deep breath. Images flashed in his mind. The crime scene by the lake that he'd surveyed briefly on his way here. The blood-soaked picnic blanket. The car door scrawled with a cryptic tally of dates in black markerin. Wikipedia.org. The meaning was clear. 12/20/68, 7/4/69, Sept 27/69, by knife. The son of a gun had actually written down his kills. The audacity and horror of it made Narlo's stomach turn. This was no impulsive maniac. This was a predator who enjoyed his work enough to brag about it. He picked up the phone and dialed the Vallejo Police Department. As it rang, he couldn't help glancing back through the small window into Brian Hartnell's room. The young man had lost consciousness, perhaps mercifully spared from his grief and pain for the moment. We'll get him, Narlo thought to himself. If it's the last thing I do, we'll get this Zodiac. Across the Vallejo River, 2 months earlier, on the night of July 4th, 1969, the world had exploded in celebration. Fireworks crackled in the sky over Vallejo, California, as people enjoyed the holiday. Darlene Farron, 22, had spent the evening at a friend's house and then picked up 19-year-old Michael Majot for a late-night drive. The festive sounds had died down by midnight, and the young pair sought a quiet spot to talk and relax. The parking lot of Blue Rock Springs Park, a known lover's lane on the outskirts of town, just a couple miles from Lake Herman Road, where another young couple had been murdered the previous winter. Darlene parked her car in the darkness under the eucalyptus trees, and the two talked in low voices, the summer night air warm and still. Michael was in the passenger seat when he noticed something. Headlights approaching. A car pulled into the lot and came to a stop just a few feet away. Darlene frowned. Who is that? The lights were blinding, so she couldn't make out the vehicle. It was unusual to see another car here so late. For a few tense moments, the mystery car idled silently. Then, to their relief, it backed up and drove away, its headlights receding. Perhaps just a driver turning around, they thought. Michael exhaled and tried to shrug it off. They went back to their conversation, Darlene lighting a cigarette to calm her nerves. But only a few minutes passed before the headlights appeared again, sweeping over them as the car returned. Darlene sat up straight, uneasy. This time the car pulled up directly behind them, about 10 feet away. The high beams blazed into Michael's side view mirror, blinding him. I think it's the same guy, Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. He felt a prickle of fear. Darlene bit her lip. Maybe it's a cop checking on us, she suggested hopefully, though deep down she didn't believe it. What kind of officer circles around like that? Before they could decide anything, the driver of the other car stepped out. Michael squinted against the glare and saw only a silhouette approaching on the passenger side. His side, Darlene started to fumble in her purse. Do I have my ID? She began. But the thought was cut off by the figure suddenly at Michael's window. A brilliant white light flooded the car's interior. The stranger was shining a flashlight directly in Michael's face, obscuring his own features. Michael instinctively raised his hand to shield his eyes. In the same instant, a deafening bang shattered the quiet. Michael felt something punch into his neck and face, the shocking pain only registering an instant later. He'd been shot. He heard Darlene scream beside him as another gunshot rang out, then another, and another, in rapid succession. The muzzle flashes, lighting up the car. Glass shattered. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. Michael threw his arms up, twisting in agony as bullets tore through him. Darlene cried out in pain. She'd been hit too. Blood spattered the dashboard and seats. Michael could hardly breathe. One bullet had ripped into his jaw and tongue. Another lodged in his shoulder. In a frenzy of terror, he tried to crawl over into the back seat or anywhere to escape the onslaught. The gunshots ceased for a brief moment. Michael, choking on blood, dared to look up. The figure with the flashlight was walking calmly back towards his own car, as if the job were done. Michael's shaking hand reached for Darlene. She was slumped over the wheel, moaning softly, her white blouse drenched red. We have to get help, Michael gurgled. though he could barely form words with his destroyed jaw. Just as he reached for the door handle, unbelievably, the attacker returned. The car door creaked as the man leaned back inside. Michael felt the cold barrel of the gun press against his forearm, and then bang, he screamed as another bullet ripped through him. The man turned and fired 2 more shots directly into Darlene at point-blank range. Her scream died away. Michael lost consciousness for a few seconds. When he came to, the mysterious shooter was gone, and all that remained was the ringing echo of gunfire and the throb of pain in every inch of Michael's body. He forced himself out of the car, collapsing on the ground, and managed to crawl a few feet despite searing agony. Headlights appeared once more, but this time it was a group of teenagers driving into the lot. Michael used his last strength to wave an arm and scream for help. The horrified teens rushed to aid the bloodied couple and sped off to find a phone to call the police in. Wikipedia.org. Within minutes, Vallejo police cars and an ambulance converged on the park. Darlene Farron was rushed to the hospital, but by 12:30 a.m., she was pronounced dead. Incredibly, Michael Majot survived his grievous wounds. As he was treated, he stammered out a description of the attacker, a heavy-set white man, about 5'8", maybe 195-200 pounds, with short, light brown curly hair. In Wikipedia.org. Michael's voice shook as he recounted the horror through a wired jaw and immense pain. The police canvassed the scene, but found frustratingly little. Shell casings from a 9mm handgun, bullet holes, blood. There were no tire tracks or fingerprints left behind. Then, at 12:40 a.m., less than an hour after the shooting, something chilling occurred. The Vallejo Police Department's phone rang, and the police dispatcher answered. On the line was an eerie, calm male voice. "I want to report a double murder," the caller said, matter-of-factly. "If you go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway to the public park, you'll find the kids in a brown car. They've been shot with a 9mm Luger." The dispatcher's blood ran cold as the voice added, before hanging up, "I also killed those kids last year." And Wikipedia.org. The line went dead. The police traced the call and found it had been placed from a payphone just a few blocks from the station. Officers rushed there, but it was deserted. The killer had slipped away into the night. The reference to last year's kids immediately made investigators connect the dots. On December 20th, 1968, not far from this park on Lake Herman Road, 2 teenagers had been found shot to death in their car. At the time, it had been an unsolved one-off murder. Now, the shooter on this July 4th was claiming responsibility for that crime as well. A serial killer was on the loose, linking his atrocities with taunting phone calls. Over the next month, the mystery man began a bizarre communication with the public that would make headlines across the country. On August 3rd, 1969, the Vallejo Times-Herald, San Francisco Chronicle, and San Francisco Examiner, newspapers each received nearly identical letters from someone purporting to be the killer in Wikipedia.org. Each letter was written in a crude scrawl, rife with misspellings and a tone of chilling pride. "I am the killer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman and the girl last 4th of July." The letters declared in .wikipedia.org. Details in the notes proved that the author truly was at the crime scenes. In each envelope, the killer included 1/3 of a cryptogram, a complex cipher of symbols. The writer insisted that the newspapers print these ciphers on the front page, threatening that if they didn't, he would spend the weekend cruising around and killing lone people in the night until I end up with a dozen people over the weekend. doenwikipedia.org. The audacity shocked law enforcement and the media. Here was a murderer not only confessing, but also engaging in a deadly game of cat and mouse. Under pressure and public fear, the newspapers published the ciphers, inviting anyone to help decode the man's message. Just a few days later, on August 4th, another letter arrived at the San Francisco Examiner. This one began with an unnerving salutation. Dear editor, this is the Zodiac speaking. n.wikipedia.org. It was the first time the world heard the name the killer had given himself, the Zodiac. The name would become synonymous with terror. In this longer letter, the self-styled Zodiac provided details about the shootings that had not been released to the public, silencing any remaining doubters of his authenticity. He casually described how he had taped a flashlight to the barrel of his gun to aim in the dark at Lake Herman Road. He talked about picking off the young couple at Blue Rock Springs. He sneered that when the police cracked his cipher, they will have me, mocking the authorities' desperation to learn his identity. Wikipedia.org. As cryptographers and hobbyists feverishly tried to solve the ciphers, a couple in Salinas, California, schoolteacher Donald Hardin and his wife Betty, spent evenings hunched over the strange characters. By August 8th, they succeeded. The Z4-8 cipher, as it was known, was cracked, and its plaintext revealed the killer's deranged philosophy. In misspelled, stunted sentences, the Zodiac wrote, I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing a wild game in the forest, because man is the most dangerous animal of all. When I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and those I have killed will become my slaves. nwikipedia.org. The cipher didn't include the killer's name. He teasingly said he wouldn't give that away because it would slow down or stop his collection of slaves. For the afterlifein.wikipedia.org. The message was horrifying, depicting a man who saw murder as a grand sport and spiritual duty. It sent chills down the spines of all who read it. Summer turned to fall, with the Bay Area gripped in fear of the unknown Zodiac Killer. Police patrols were doubled in lovers' lanes and remote spots. Young couples thought twice before parking in secluded areas. Gun sales spiked as people armed themselves against the faceless menace. Despite an onslaught of tips and a few potential suspects, the police had little to go on except composite sketches of a stocky white male and the letters that arrived intermittently, always signed with that crossed circle symbol. Then, just 2 weeks after the attack at Lake Berryessa, the Zodiac struck again, this time in the heart of San Francisco, in the well-to-do Presidio Heights neighborhood. It was October 11th, 1969, a little before 10 p.m., when Paul Stein, a 29-year-old cab driver and graduate student, picked up a fare in downtown San Francisco. The passenger, a stocky man with horn-rimmed glasses, according to witnesses who glimpsed him later, requested a ride to Washington and Maple Streets in Presidio Heights. As Stein's taxi rolled into the intersection of Washington and Cherry, the man in the back seat silently pulled out a gun. Without any warning, he pressed it against the back of Paul Stein's head and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was muffled by the car, but loud enough to be heard by some neighborhood kids across the street. They watched in shock from an upstairs window. as the cab coasted to a stop against the curb. Wikipedia.org. Inside, Paul Stein's body slumped onto the passenger seat, lifeless. What happened next was even more chilling. The children saw the stranger in the back seat lean forward and casually take out a cloth to wipe down areas he had touched in Wikipedia.org. He then slid out of the taxi, supporting the driver's limp body to lay him more fully on the seat, and with almost methodical calm, he reached into the cab to tear off a piece of the victim's bloodied shirt. The man tucked the grisly trophy into his pocket. Under the streetlight, the kids got a clear look at him. A heavy-set man, crew-cut hair, wearing glasses and dark clothing. For a brief moment, the man's gaze swept up and down the street. The kids ducked behind their curtain, heart hammering, afraid he'd spotted them. When they looked again, the man was walking away, disappearing into the night, just as a police car came roaring into view. Moments earlier, those children had called the police, breathless and terrified. A man just shot a taxi driver right in front of our house. The dispatcher had put out an alert, but crucially described the suspect incorrectly as a black male, an error in relaying the kid's description, and Wikipedia.org. Wikipedia.org. Because of that mistake, when two patrol officers encountered a white man on the street just blocks away, they thought nothing of it. The man had seemed calm, even nodded to them when they asked if he'd seen anything unusual. The officers sped off to search elsewhere, never realizing they'd let the killer slip right through their finger. And Wikipedia.org. The Zodiac later gleefully claimed in a letter that he was that very man who chatted with the cops and that they about caught me that night in Wikipedia, Oregon, Wikipedia.org. The murder of Paul Stein marked a dangerous turn. The Zodiac had come into the city, and he had killed not young lovers in a deserted spot, but a random adult male in a populated neighborhood. The motive clearly wasn't robbery. Stein's wallet and car keys were taken, but the act of cutting a swatch of the victim's shirt was a ghastly calling card. The San Francisco Police Department launched a massive manhunt. Roadblocks were set up, helicopters whirred overhead that night, but the Zodiac was a ghost once more. Within days, another letter from the killer arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle. Enclosed was a blood-stained piece of Paul Stein's shirt, proof positive who the letter was from. In the letter, the Zodiac taunted the police for failing to catch him, and even claimed he had watched from the shadows as they responded to the CNN. Wikipedia.org. He ended this letter with a macabre threat. He would target school children next. He wrote that he would just shoot out the front tire of a school bus and pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out. Wikipedia.org. This vivid threat sent waves of panic through the city. For weeks, police squad cars followed school buses, and parents clutched their children tightly. Meanwhile, detectives Bill Armstrong and Dave Toshi of SFPD were assigned to the Zodiac case, joining forces with investigators from Vallejo, Napa, and other jurisdictions. And Wikipedia.org. The FBI even stepped in to assist. The pressure to stop the Zodiac was immense, but despite the composite sketches and dozens of leads, the killer remained at large and continued his provocative correspondence. On November 8, 1969, a card, known as the Dripping Pen card, arrived with a new cipher of 340 characters, which would remain unsolved for 50 years. On November 9th, another letter with detailed ramblings and a bomb diagram claimed 7 victims so far. The killer's tone swung between gloating and sardonic. at one point saying, "I have laughed at the police," and urging them to wear Zodiac buttons he was designing. A particularly frightening episode occurred on the night of March 22, 1970. A young woman named Kathleen Johns was driving with her infant daughter near Modesto, California, on her way to visit family. As she drove down a lonely highway, another car began tailgating her, blinking its lights and honking. Concerned that something was wrong, Kathleen pulled over. The driver of the other car, a man, stepped out and approached with a friendly smile. He told her that her car's wheel was loose and offered to tighten it. Grateful for the help, Kathleen allowed it. The man tinkered by her wheel and then returned, saying, "All set." But as soon as Kathleen pulled back onto the road, her car lurched. The wheel came flying off. The helpful stranger was suddenly back at her window, offering to give her and her baby a ride to a gas station. Stranded and vulnerable, Kathleen accepted. The man drove Kathleen and her infant, but as they passed the first gas station, he did not stop. Instead, he pressed on into the dark, rural expanse. Red flags went up in Kathleen's mind. Her heart began to hammer. "Why didn't you stop?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The man ignored the question, his face concealed in shadows. He drove for an hour, then two, winding down desolate back roads. Kathleen's baby fussed in her arms, sensing her mother's fear. At one point, Kathleen dared to venture. "Do you always help strangers like this?" The man's chilling answer was, "By the time I get through with them, they won't need my help." N.Wikipedia.org. His tone was almost jovial, as if sharing a private joke. Kathleen's blood turned to ice. She realized she was trapped in the car with a predator. She glanced at his eyes. They were dark, flat, emotionless. He periodically told her, with an odd casualness, "You know I'm going to kill you, don't you?" Nwikipedia.org. Kathleen would try to laugh it off, as if he must be joking, hoping to keep him calm. But every time, his words came back, steady and serious. He was going to kill her. There was no joke. Fate provided one sliver of an opportunity. As the car slowed at an intersection, Kathleen knew it might be her only chance. With her heart in her throat, she cradled her baby tightly and leapt out of the moving car, darting into the darkness off the side of the road. She tumbled down into an irrigation ditch, miraculously shielding her child in her arms. The man cursed and stopped the car. Kathleen crouched in the cold muck, clapping a hand over her baby's mouth to stifle any cries, hardly daring to breathe. She heard the crunch of the man's footsteps and saw the beam of a flashlight slicing through the night as he searched the roadside. The light swept over the ditch just above her head. Kathleen bit her lip until she tasted blood, praying her daughter would not wail. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated. The man gave up and returned to his car, and Kathleen heard him drive off into the night. In Wikipedia.org. Shaking and crying in relief, Kathleen climbed back up to the road once she was sure he was gone. Eventually, a passing driver found her and took her to the nearest police station, Patterson, California. There, as she gave her statement, she noticed a wanted poster on the wall with the now infamous composite sketch from the Paul Stein killing. Kathleen gasped and felt the room spin. The face drawn on the poster, the stocky man with horn-rimmed glasses, looked eerily like the stranger who had just abducted her. "Oh my God," she sputtered, pointing at the poster. "That's him. That's the man who tried to kill me tonight." And Wikipedia.org. Police went out to search where Kathleen's car had been left. They found it torched and smoldering. The man had returned to set it on fire, perhaps to destroy evidence and Wikipedia.org. It was clear that Kathleen Johns had narrowly escaped becoming another victim of the Zodiac. When this account hit the newspapers, the public's image of the Zodiac expanded from a shooter to a more elusive terror, a man who could play the concerned Good Samaritan one moment and a sadistic kidnapper the next. Throughout 1970 and 1971, the Zodiac continued to feed his ego through letters and cards to the press. In a Halloween card sent to Chronicle reporter Paul Avery, he scrawled, "Peekaboo, you are doomed," amidst a creepy design, a direct threat that unnerved the journalist and his colleagues. Avery, who had been covering the case extensively, started carrying a .38 revolver for protection and joked darkly with friends by pinning a button to his chest that read, "I am not Paul Avery." The Chronicle offices installed a buzzer alarm system, and police arranged to discreetly watch Avery's home for a time. The Zodiac seemed to delight in spreading fear beyond his immediate victims. As years passed, and the Zodiac's taunting correspondence gradually slowed, the investigation slogged on with periodic spikes of activity. Hundreds of suspects were questioned. One name, mentioned early on, kept floating back to the top of the list, a man by the name of Arthur Lee Allen. In 1971, detectives in Vallejo interviewed Allen after a friend reported some disturbing comments and behaviors. Allen was a 30-something-year-old man with a checkered past. He had been fired from a school teacher job and had a conviction that labeled him a sex offender. Detectives found that Allen had been in the vicinity of Lake Berryessa on the very day of the stabbings, supposedly scuba diving alone. They noticed he wore a wristwatch decorated with the Zodiac's crossed circle symbol. When asked about guns, Allen admitted having pistols of the same caliber used in the shootings, though he claimed they'd been stolen. During a tense interview, one detective casually asked, "So, Arthur, did you ever read those Zodiac letters in the newspaper?" Allen replied with a strange, small smile, "I haven't read the Chronicle in a while." It was an odd response. The detective hadn't specified which newspaper. Legend has it that as the investigators left that day, Allen muttered something cryptic like, "You guys really think I'm the Zodiac, don't you?" They hadn't actually accused him out loud at that point. The hairs stood up on the back of the detectives' necks. They felt sure they had their man, or at least the best suspect yet. In 1972, search warrant was executed on Allen's home and trailer. They found some weapons and disturbing writings, but nothing that could definitively link him to the Zodiac's crimes. No guns matching the ballistics, no hidden stash of shirt pieces or costume hood. Handwriting experts compared Allen's hand to the neat, architect-like printing in Zodiac's letters and declared it did not match. The evidence remained frustratingly circumstantial. Allen insisted he was innocent. With no solid proof, the case against him stalled, and Allen went free, though he stayed on law enforcement's radar for decades. And so the mystery continued to deepen. After 1971, the Zodiac's communications became sporadic. The last confirmed letter came in January 1974, a strange note referencing the movie The Exorcist and giving a score of me number 37 SFPD or 0, implying he had killed 37 people in Wikipedia.org.wikipedia orgs. Whether that body count was truthful or just another mind game was anyone's guess. In that same letter, the Zodiac signaled what seemed to be a goodbye, calling the Exorcist movie the best satirical comedy he had ever seen. Then, just like that, he fell silent. Leads dried up. The task force that had once bustled with activity slowly thinned out. Detectives retired or moved on, their careers haunted by the case they couldn't crack. Dave Toschi, the San Francisco detective who had become the public face of the investigation, found himself taken off the case after a few years amidst office politics. But he continued to privately obsess over it well into the 80s. Ken Narlow in Napa held onto the file until he too retired in 1987, never stopping his quiet hunt for the truth in Wikipedia.org. As the decades rolled on, the Zodiac Killer case became the stuff of legend and morbid fascination. It spawned books, movies, fervent amateur sleuth communities, all trying to do what official investigators could not: name the man behind the mask. Yet the case officially remained unsolved in Wikipedia.org. Evidence sat in files and vaults, awaiting some future breakthrough. Some fingerprints had been lifted, including a partial print from Paul Stein's cab. Some DNA might exist from saliva on stamps, but none of it definitively matched anyone, not even Arthur Lee Allen, who died in 1992, still proclaiming his innocence. Late one evening in the fall of 1979, nearly a decade after the terror began, Dave Toschi sat at his kitchen table in San Francisco, poring over a thick binder of Zodiac case notes for the 100th time. Outside the window, the city lights twinkled and a foghorn sounded in the bay. Toschi's apartment was quiet, his wife and daughters long asleep. A single lamp lit the pages before him. Crime scene photos, letters filled with cryptograms and smug taunts, reports of interviews with suspects. Toschi removed his horn-rimmed glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. In the silence, he could almost hear the echoes of those days. The shrill ring of the phone when a new Zodiac letter arrived, the crackle of the police radio reporting another body found, the gasp of a survivor whispering a description of a hooded attacker. He reached into a file and pulled out a plastic evidence bag containing a scrap of aged cloth, a piece of Paul Stein's bloodied shirt. It was a macabre relic sent by the killer to prove his claim. Toschi held it gingerly, the dried blood now a rust-brown stain. How many times had he looked at this piece of cloth and willed it to divulge the identity of its sender? Too many to count. His mind drifted to the victims, those whose lives were ended or forever scarred. Betty Lou Jensen, David Faraday, Darlene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepard, Paul Stein, and survivors like Mike Mageau and Brian Hartnell, who would carry the physical and emotional scars forever. He thought of Kathleen Johns, who would likely always check her rearview mirror with a twinge of panic on the lonely roads. Each name carried a weight of unrealized futures and enduring nightmares. Toschi walked to the window and gazed out at the blanket of fog rolling through the Golden Gate. Somewhere out there, the man who called himself Zodiac might still be alive. Perhaps he was looking up at the same moon, living an ordinary life by day, harboring dark secrets by night. Perhaps he was dead or incarcerated for some other crime, taking his secrets to the grave. The uncertainty was a torment in itself. He recalled a line from one of the killer's early letters. The Zodiac had written that killing was so much fun, and that he would never give his name because it would stop his collecting of slaves for the Afterlifen.wikipedia.org. Such a grandiose, deranged proclamation, yet the man had stuck to it. He never did give his name. It frustrated Toshi endlessly that one narcissistic murderer could dupe everyone and melt away like smoke. On the wall, a clock ticked past midnight. Toshi sighed and closed the binder. There would be no sudden epiphany tonight. The binder, the files, they would still be here tomorrow and the next day. As he prepared to head to bed, he flipped off the lamp. Darkness enveloped the room, and in that darkness, the detective's reflection faintly appeared on the window pane. For a split second, it almost looked like another figure, heavy-set, lurking just behind him. Toski's hand twitched toward the sidearm. He still kept holstered at his waist, even off duty, but it was only his imagination, crafting phantoms from stress and fatigue. He turned away, leaving the ghosts of the case in the darkened kitchen. Before retiring for the night, Toshi checked on his sleeping daughters, gently brushing a hair off the forehead of his youngest. He vowed silently that monsters like the Zodiac would not haunt their futures. As he closed their bedroom door, he hoped that someday, somehow, the Zodiac Killer would be unmasked and brought to justice, or at least that the families of the fallen could know the truth. But for now, the mystery endured, chilling and unresolved. The case of the Zodiac remained an open wound, a true human thriller that had begun with a pair of teenagers on a winter's night and spiraled into a saga of fear and intrigue. In the annals of American crime, it stood as a grim testament to the darkness that can lurk behind an ordinary facade. And in quiet moments, people throughout Northern California would still glance over their shoulders in the dark, wondering if the boogeyman with the crossed circle signature might ever return. For those who lived through it, the memory never faded. The sudden headlights on a lonely road, the hooded figure by the lake, the cryptic letters in the daily paper. It was a real nightmare that unfolded in slow motion, more terrifying because it was true. The Zodiac's shadow loomed long after his last communication, an unresolved chord in the collective psyche. And even today, if you find yourself driving down a quiet highway at night and you notice a car following too close or see a stranger lingering in the tree line at dusk, you might feel a prickle of fear, a distant echo of the terror the Zodiac sowed. The true identity of the monster may still be a mystery, but the very human fear he evoked is real and lasting. It's the kind of fear that gives you goosebumps when you least expect it, that makes your heart race at a twig's snap in the darkness. It's the reminder that sometimes the most chilling horrors are not supernatural at all, but human beings with twisted desires, walking among us in plain sight. The story of the Zodiac Killer is not just a tale of an unidentified murderer. It is a portrait of suspense itself, an open-ended nightmare where the final chapter remains unwritten. And until that chapter is finally closed, the Zodiac's eerie salutation still hangs in the air of history. This is the Zodiac speaking.